Thanks very much, Prime Minister. Thank you, Peter. I'll hand over to Barbara, Barbara Halls, to introduce Greg.
A warm welcome to all of you men and women out there in the cloud, to the West Papuan Women's Office, because today we're launching a book, JFK versus Allen Dulles, written by Greg Poulgrain. First of all, I want to share with you 3 lies. The first lie is about Britain during World War II. And the government spread the lie that carrots were very good for your eyesight because it wanted to conceal that the reason why British bombers were doing better on bombing missions against the enemy is because they had radar. They were working with radar, but they used the lie about if you eat your carrots, you get better eyesight. The second lie I want to talk about is to do with the Australian government telling us that we must protect our borders from refugees and then locking them up. And this lie conceals the brutality of the Australian government's policy. Yes, we don't want people to, boat smugglers to exploit people, but basically we are being brutal. The third lie I want to share, which is very relevant to Greg Poulgrain's book, is the lie that fighting communism makes us free, and that West Papua had to be handed over to Indonesia in order to stop the spread of communism. Now, at this point, I'm going to get us to focus on 3 men. The first, Dag Hammarskjöld, Secretary General of the United Nations, realized that the world was pretty unbalanced and that the newly emerging colonial, or those nations coming out of the colonies, were needed in order to balance the power of the West. And he had a program for assisting people emerging from colonialism. The second person I want to talk about is JFK, and he was of like mind with Dag Hammarskjöld, because he knew that West Papua was an issue, a very, very special issue. And like Dag Hammarskjöld, the way to go was to give the West Papuans choice about becoming a nation. Their nationhood was sacrificed. And this is what Greg Poulgrain is able to explain to us why it happened. It's Edison Waromi has dwelt upon this issue, and Greg Poulgrain has dug into the whole business that since 1936, the likes of Nelson Rockefeller have wanted to access the resources of West Papua. It's a shocking book to read. A little bit about Greg Poulgrain. I first read his work in The Age newspaper. It was just before Christmas, just before the New Year, and he was talking about the infant mortality rate on the south coast of West Papua. It was 60%. 60% of babies were dying between birth and 1 year. And I found that a terrible thing to understand. And I very happily hand you over to Greg Poulgrain.
Right, thank you. I'll just connect here with the presentation that I've prepared, if I can. Where are we? So, thank you. Can you see that clearly? Cast a cold eye. Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so basically I'm just going to introduce Indonesia as a big place. So I've got a map to show you what Indonesia looks like transposed onto USA. That's Portland, Oregon, and Indonesia, the archipelago stretches right across USA, that is with New Guinea, well, half of New Guinea, the other half is cut off from Jayapura down to Meraki, with New Guinea extraneous to the United States of America. So from Sabang, which is where Portland is on that map, from Sabang to Meraki, as the crow flies, is 5,247 kilometers, so it's a very big place. But if you actually want to go down Sumatra, down Java, and from Java go to Papua, it's actually 5,940 kilometers. It's a huge archipelago, the biggest in the world. The question we're looking at is Alan Dulles' interest in this huge archipelago. I calculated that it's actually almost 1/7 of the equator. The east-west extent of the archipelago is 1/7 of the equator, 13% of the circumference of the Earth. It is huge, as in the island of New Guinea itself is the largest tropical island in the world. So why was Alan Dulles interested in this place? Well, profit. The Indonesian economy now is 16th largest in the world, as I say, and it's on track to be in the top 4 in 2050. At the time when Dulles was interested, he was with Standard Oil or Rockefeller Oil Empire. It was the biggest company in the world, but in the time that we're looking at, we're going back to the 1600s, the VOC was the biggest country in the world, the biggest company in the world. And that's a shot there of the headquarters to get an idea. What made them big? They were dealing in spice and things like nutmeg, which was actually traded, nutmeg was traded from Papua back around the Roman times. Mace is also part of the inner skin of nutmeg. It's the secret ingredient of Coca-Cola. Cloves, important as well in preserving meat and such things like that. So that gave spice a value which was equivalent to gold in those days. 1600s, the VOC was the richest country in the world, richest company in the world. Value, 7.9 trillion was estimated. So I've shown you there how many big companies today piled together would be the equivalent of the VOC, yeah? Like Amazon, Facebook, Apple, whatever, all put together, 7.9 trillion, and that was the approximate value of the Dutch East India Company. It's a huge, huge company. The Dutch invented the modern banking system to create this colossus. This gives you an idea of where the spice was coming from. You can see the map of Indonesia there with the spice islands down, if it's marked. But that island there of Run was the last British, well, it was the first British island of what became the British Empire. And it was the last stronghold of the British. The Dutch forced them out. And I'd just like to include the note that the Dutch did a bit of an exchange for the island of Run for Manhattan, which you may know that already. Yeah? So the spice and Indonesia was an extremely rich place. The Dutch extended their hold over the archipelago over the next 300 years. And there's a picture there of them sort of how that basically it was military power that allowed them or enabled them to extend their colonial hold over the next 300 years until the mid-20th century. That's when the Japanese army, Imperial Army, invaded, and it brought an end to Dutch colonial rule. The aim of the Japanese, I'd like to point out, the aim of the Japanese expansion south was to claim the island of New Guinea. They wanted to make it a new Japan. They wanted its natural resources. Southeast Asia and possibly China would have been the market for Japanese manufactured goods, but it was New Guinea they wanted for the natural resources. and they'd send out scientists before the war began over to New Guinea to familiarise themselves with the occupants, the inhabitants of the country, which is quite an amazing step to take. So Alan Dulles was an employee of Rockefeller Oil, as I said, from the 1920s, and he could see the potential in the Indies. His focus on the untouched Netherlands, New Guinea, was roughly equivalent to what the Japanese wanted 20 years later. But Rockefeller had been trying to access Netherlands, New Guinea since World War I. And he finally, Alan Dulles was successful finally in 1935. He formed a company. That was Dutch-Indonesian company, 60% controlled by Rockefeller interests. And this was the company that located the gold that's changed the history of West Papua ever since. They found gold in 1936 in the highlands of New Guinea, the remote highlands, and it was the world's, they knew at the time it was the world's largest deposit, twice as big as the biggest at the time, largest primary deposit of gold. And then 6 months before the Japanese invasion in 1941, they found oil as well. It was the richest oil they'd ever found. So basically, you're looking at a stretch of land which was extremely rich in natural resources. Indonesia won its independence. History intervened. Indonesia won its independence in 1949 from the Dutch, got rid of colonial control. But of course, we can see now why, precisely why the Dutch retained the western half of New Guinea, for various reasons put out, but essentially it was rich. Only Alan Dulles and the Dutch political elite were aware of the gold and the oil, not the Dutch public, not even Indonesia. The amazing amount of natural resources was kept secret by Rockefeller interests and by the Dutch elite. Part of this elite was Luns, who became foreign minister for 17 years. His job, when he first became in the early 50s, was to keep Netherlands, New Guinea in Dutch hands. Indonesia received secret US assistance to launch a campaign against Dutch colonial rule. Foreign Minister Sunario from 1955 told me about this secret fund. Luns, when he was Secretary General of NATO, when I interviewed him, told me that he offered to share the gold mine with the Americans, the American interests, the Rockefeller interests, that is. But the reply that he got was that they'd get it for themselves when the Dutch were gone, which was rather blunt. And that's exactly what they did. So Alan Dulles, in the 1950s, was Director of Central Intelligence under President Eisenhower. That's when the Cold War was really getting into swing. Starting in 1955, Dulles began plotting to oust President Sukarno. That is, he was calling him a communist even then, when even Richard Nixon, who was vice president under Eisenhower, saw him as a nationalist. There were 7 assassination attempts on Sukarno. I thought I'd just tell you about one. Some of them were plane crashes, attempted plane crashes, bombs in cars. But the one we probably know best was the grenade attack at Cikini in Jakarta, the one where hand grenades were thrown in the school where Sukarno's children were attending, actually. Radical Muslims were blamed incorrectly, a trick that President Suharto's intelligence chief, Ali Motopo, later used quite a lot. And more recently, for those who follow Indonesian history, Munir, Indonesian activist, he realized the same trick was used in the Bali bombing in 2002. I spoke with a person who was incorrectly blamed for planning the failed Cikini assassination. He was former intelligence chief, Zulkifli Lubis. And I also spoke with a man who saved Sukarno's life. He saw the hand grenades thrown, one was coming close to Sukarno, so he pushed the president over, jumped on top to protect his body with his own body, and Sukarno survived. And so did the officer. He survived okay, got an instant promotion and a good job for the rest of his life, looking after army pensions. And I met him when he was still working. There's a shot of the New Guinea highlands showing you the snow and Rockefeller interests. They couldn't really gain control, gain access to the wealth of New Guinea until the right political moment, the right political climate. So to achieve that, Dulles adopted a strategy. I call it Dulles Indonesia strategy. First of all, he had to get rid of the Dutch colonial power occupying Netherlands, New Guinea. Then he had to curb, there was the threat, Papuan independence put forward by Hammarskjöld. He had to get rid of Hammarskjöld. That's what I will explain later. Sukarno was then given control of West New Guinea in 1963, on the 1st of May 1963, but that's at the same time as giving Sukarno West New Guinea, they were planning the downfall of Sukarno, the ending of Sukarno. And that was partly done by a centralized army command in 58 and also the coup in 1965-66. So Dulles realized Sukarno would help, first off, the Indonesian people rather than foreign companies. So he began planning regime change to replace Sukarno with a military regime. Preparing for this in 1958, Dulles began a civil war in Indonesia, and we call it today the Outer Islands Rebellion, or the PRRI. The end result, thanks to Alan Dulles, was a strong, centralized army headquarters in Jakarta, which before 1958 Indonesia didn't have. A centralized army command under General Suharto was essential, first of all, to oust the Dutch, and then in 65-66 to oust President Sukarno. So Dulles was really a Machiavellian master. He was planning ahead. Why? Because Indonesia was so absolutely rich with natural resources, and he was determined to get what formerly was the world's richest colony. Until World War II, Netherlands and Guinea did not have much Dutch rule at all. It was up to World War II, it was only 5% of the territory was under colonial control. That is 95% up to World War II was Papuan. It was Netherlands and Guinea was actually a misnomer, right? If only 5% was controlled by the Dutch. People tend to forget that. And I often ask, how can the Japanese arrange to give control of such a territory when only 5% was Dutch controlled? Huh? In the 50s, the more that the Dutch decided to colonize the Papuans in the 1950s, the louder became the Indonesian call for the Dutch to leave. Rockefeller interests did not want the Papuans to be given independence. Neither did Sukarno. He knew nothing about the goal, but his quest to oust the Dutch really was quietly being funded by Rockefeller interests. To unite his people, Sukarno turned up the dial on Indonesian nationalism. He focused on the anti-colonial struggle of ousting the Dutch from Netherlands to Guinea, hoping to generate more unity in the same way that the struggle for independence 45-49 had brought Indonesians together. Barbara mentioned some lies before, and there were two particular lies I wanted to talk about. That lie number one, where was it? The lie number one here was about the territory was impoverished, had no natural resources. And the second lie was that the Papuans themselves were incapable of forming a modern state. That had largely come about because of the disappearance of Michael Rockefeller. That was Michael Rockefeller, they said, was eaten on the beach with sago, a bit like scene out of Robinson Crusoe. Huh? But what really happened to Michael Rockefeller? So I must ask you to read the book and find out. But basically, I can say I did interview Rene Wassink, who was with the anthropologist who was with Michael Rockefeller when he disappeared, and on the 18th of November 1961. And he told me really the story that when I repeated that story to General Nasution, he agreed. He actually agreed. He said, after investigating himself, this is General Nasution, head of the Indonesian army, after he investigated that story later on and found it was completely false. The whole cannibal story was incorrect, he said. Anyway, people still pursue that idea today because it makes good press, I think. So it also takes away a lot of, well, in 1969, it took away a lot of impact for Papuans to, in 62, 63, for their own, to have their own state. 17 was about Nasution. Nasution was head of the army, right? He head of the Indonesian army. He was, I mean, what Eddie Waromi before mentioned the Cold War and communism. Nasution was the anti-communist, pro-US head of the Indonesian army. In 60, just at the end of 1960, he went to Moscow to finalize a huge arms deal just before President Kennedy had been inaugurated. So Kennedy, on his first day in office, had a very huge problem facing him because the Soviets were backing Indonesia in the quest to out the Dutch, in the quest to oust the Dutch. Yeah? Kennedy wanted Indonesia on side in the Cold War. He found out that Nasution, and I checked with Nasution and I checked with the US records, Nasution wrote a secret message to US Secretary of State Dean Rusk. He said even though he went to Moscow to get the weapons, he definitely was pro-US. So they knew the threat of communism in West Papua was false. It helped our Prime Minister here to change his mind. Barwick and Menzies changed their mind when they found that out as well. Kennedy, a Cold War confrontation with Indonesia backed by Soviet weapons. So what did he do? He quietly asked UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld to help. Now, he couldn't do this openly because it would anger the Soviets. It would make the Cold War worse if the UN Secretary General was working secretly with Kennedy. So it was kept fairly quiet. Dag Hammarskjöld was introducing a new UN policy to deal with a large number of African colonies that were becoming independent. He was willing to provide a newly independent country with UN assistance for 6 years in the form of UN experts and various departments to construct for the independent country a viable economy. He was planning to introduce this plan, he called it OPEX, to the UN General Assembly in late 1961 in relation to Papua. That is, it meant that the Papuans would be granted independence at the end of 61 and take away that whole Soviet sovereignty dispute that had been going on since the early 50s. So Papuans would be independent without Dutch strings attached. The anti-colonial cry, which was so loud in Indonesia and actually had support from the Afro-Asian countries as well, would be removed from the sovereignty dispute between Holland and Indonesia. So that's the importance of what Hammarskjöld and Kennedy were planning. The Papuans themselves, well, some did, some didn't. They realized they were sitting on a wonderful, huge island, but they didn't realize they were sitting on gold and copper deposits that would have made them one of the richest countries in the world. So Kennedy basically brought in Hammarskjöld to avoid conflict with the Soviet Union, to avoid a Cold War conflict, which was on his desk the first day when he arrived in the White House. Hammarskjöld was keen to do that because it was exactly what he was after. It suited his OPEX plan. And the person who told me this was George Ivan Smith, his deputy, his assistant adjutant, anyway. George was an Australian, and I met him in Stroud in England, and in our first meeting, it's interesting, we went through some history, and as I was leaving, we both discovered we had spent time in Brisbane. So he said, come back. And that's when I came back the second time, he explained more fully his understanding, his close friendship with Dag Hammarskjöld. And he himself spent the rest of his life trying to solve the Hammarskjöld assassination. Hammarskjöld was killed in a plane crash in the Congo shortly before the UN General Assembly was to start in New York. And that was the tragedy. Had UN Secretary General implemented OPEX, he would have angered the Soviet Union, but at the same time, he would have defused the whole Cold War tension that was being built up. So it would have worked. On the one hand, we had the Soviet Union backing Indonesia with ships and planes. And on the other, USA, we had the commitment to back the Netherlands because of the NATO alliance. And China too was keen to see the Dutch end their colonial rule. When Hammarskjöld was killed in 1961, there was no clear evidence at the time it was assassination. But since 1961, various documents have emerged showing Alan Dulles was involved in the assassination by plane crash. That book by Susan Williams in 2001 restarted this investigation. I've discussed the assassination with her, and my conclusion is that, there was another plane, Fuga Magistral, there was this, and there was talk of another little smaller bomb. But my conclusion is that during the plane that was left, before he took that final fateful flight, it was left unattended for a few hours. And in that time, someone fiddled with the altimeters. And that's what confused the pilot being brought in. The plane that attacked the UN Secretary General's plane brought a moment of confusion, and then looking at the altimeters, which had been adjusted, the plane crashed. And the first thing that happened was the altimeters were ripped out and sent back to America for checking. And who gave the approval that everything was working well was J. Edgar Hoover, in charge of the FBI, who was a close friend of Alan Dulles. Now, official investigations over the last 60 years have not questioned at all this conclusion by J. Edgar Hoover about the altimeters. And I think that's where the re-investigation should focus at this, to find out what really happened. Dulles had a bad record in the Congo. He had already been involved in the death of the first president of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba. And this was brought out in not until 1975 by the US Senate investigation, Senator Church. He investigated the death of Lumumba and found Alan Dulles, at the time was head of the CIA. He had primary responsibility for the death of Patrice Lumumba. And Susan Williams found out the same intelligence group in the Congo linked to the CIA involved in the death of Lumumba were also involved in the death of Hammarskjöld. So it's highly likely that with further investigation, they will get to the answer. My book shows the motive of Alan Dulles in the elimination of the Secretary General had more to do with politics around the other side of the world, not so much, well, with the Congo, there was plenty of opportunity for the Congo, but I'm just saying Dulles wanted Hammarskjöld, and he said that, out of the way, eliminated for his own reason. He didn't explain why, but that's why I'm saying it was politics around the other side of the world. Had Hammarskjöld implemented OPEX with the Papuans, even though Hammarskjöld wasn't aware of the goal, he would have completely disrupted Alan Dulles' plans in the pipeline for regime change, which had begun back in 57, 58. Kennedy, with Hammarskjöld gone, Kennedy was forced to intervene in the sovereignty dispute between the Netherlands and Indonesia. And the result, as we all know, was the New York Agreement, 1962. UN was supposed to maintain a presence in the territory until the Papuans voted on their own future at the end of the decade. However, I just wanted to tell you before finishing, some Dutchmen, however, really, under UN auspices, wanted to assist the Papuans in any way they could, particularly the Dutchman by the name of Zylstra, who was head of the Dutch Geological Foundation. He wanted to explore the gold copper deposit on the Alpine region of Netherlands, New Guinea, the one first found in 1936. And he would have made world news, of course, when he assayed the gold there again and found it was 15 grams per tonne rather than 2 grams per tonne, as Freeport continued year after year saying the concentration was when they first began production in 1972. 15 grams per tonne made the gold deposit twice as rich as the richest in South Africa at the time. So Zylstra was going to start work in 1963, and even though the territory was no longer called Netherlands New Guinea, it was Irian Barat, he returned to the Netherlands over Christmas with his wife and was run over by a large truck one night returning home from a Christmas party with some fellow geologists. I spoke with the widow, his widow. She told me the truck ran clean over the car as she was sitting next to her husband driving home. They were going across the Afsluit Dike, which in those days was quite a narrow road, but now it's 2 lanes. It's interesting, but 2 American ladies, 2 sisters, have contacted me reading my book, and they're so interested in the death of Zylstra that they've started an investigation themselves into the death of that one man. So to end, I could say, when you're dealing with gold, I think of this quality and quantity. One Freeport director told me there's 200 years of mining ahead for Freeport Indonesia. The funeral procession can be quite lengthy. So I'll end here and some other time perhaps talk about Kennedy's involvement, which 2 years after Hammarskjöld, only 2 years, threatened to derail the Cold War ambitions of Allen Dulles. This is only, I should add, only 30 months after President Sukarno triumphantly arrived into Hollandia, or the new town then, the capital we call it Jaipur today. He arrived there in May the 1st, 1963. Only 30 months later, he was basically looking at the end of his reign. This is when Suharto took over control of the army on the 1st of October, 1965. So I'll end on that note. Thanks very much.